Hey everyone, back again. Today we're going to continue on the political economy train with David Ricardo's The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Now before jumping into it, if you want to follow me anywhere other than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy or on Twitter at David Guignot. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way that makes them accessible to you. So if you haven't already, like, share, subscribe, tell your friends, comment. I'd love to hear from you. If you found this on YouTube, you're going to be able to find it pretty much anywhere where you get podcasts, where there shouldn't be any ads. Or if you found this in podcast form, you'll be able to find the channel on YouTube, where I sometimes release videos if you're into that at all. And if you want to help me out, obviously liking, sharing, subscribing. You can also help me out monetarily via Patreon or PayPal, but no pressure. And yeah, don't want to waste any more of your time with that stuff. Let's continue on the political economy train. Now, to fill in anyone who's just jumping into this at this point, my goal, my intention is to cover Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and then move into Karl Marx. So I've already done Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So if you haven't listened to that, you can go listen to it. It's 4 parts. I know it's long, but you can go listen to that if you want. It would be helpful if you did, because some of what Ricardo does here is in direct response to Adam Smith. Now, it would be helpful, but not necessary. So at any point that Ricardo mentions Smith, criticizes Smith, and it's kind of funny because this book is a lot of Ricardo throwing shade at other political economists like Smith, Malthus, I think that's how you pronounce it, Buchanan, Say, all these thinkers David Ricardo is totally dissatisfied with. So if you want to go listen to that, you can. It won't be necessary though, because any point that I bring up Smith, I'm going to fill in the blanks so that it's clear what Ricardo is saying in relation to Smith. And then of course, following Ricardo here, I'm going to be moving into Marx at some point. So stay tuned for that. Now, okay, sorry. Long intro. Let's jump into David Ricardo's The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. So like any book, this begins with the preface, in which he describes how there are 3 broad classes of society. Now, this is important to know because these classes are always going to come up, and they kind of serve as a benchmark to understand the economic population within any nation. So these broad classes are the owners of land, who earn rent, so those are the landlords. You have the owners of stock, who are the capitalists, who own machinery, who pay laborers, who own equipment, anything like that. And then you have workers who earn wages. So for Ricardo, political economy is a science. Specifically, it is the science of these 3 classes of landlords, of capitalists, and workers, and the various dynamics that make them function together. Now, this isn't something that he mentions in the preface, but it's important to bring up in order to have a good understanding of this idea going forward. And that is capital. That is, what is capital? Now, if you think capital is money, you'd only be partly correct. In fact, capital is much broader than money. In fact, capital can even not be money at times. Or there are forms of money, or there is money that isn't capital. So for something to be capital, it must, in Ricardo's words, it must be part of the wealth of a country which is employed in production and consists of food, clothing, tools, raw materials, machinery, etc., necessary to give effect to labor. Now that's just an important thing to put on the back burner because it's a term that I'm going to throw around, and it's just important not to immediately associate it with dollar bills, with money. Now, another big term that comes up throughout the course of this book is value. Now, he spends the first chapter describing value, so we're going to just move into that here, or he tries to define it. But I want to say that value is a very tenuous term within the domain of political economy, and we will see this in Marx as well, where value is exceptionally difficult to define, because what it ultimately comes down to is people's individual preference. But as we will see throughout this whole process here, throughout this book, value is inextricably related to labor. So the value of a thing will be determined by how much labor was put into it. Now that is the very short definition, but it's one that will serve as a kind of, I guess, a point of departure for what we're going to get onto here. And that is chapter 1, on value. So for him, a commodity's value will be determined by the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production, not on the amount paid for that labor. Now, the reason that is because the amount paid for labor, wages, the value of it is going to change across time. There are going to be periods in which wages are higher than others. But what stays the same is the amount of labor required to produce a specific thing or a specific set of things. Or what I should say is that all things are going to be produced with the effect or through the effect of labor. Now, roughly, there can be two broad forms of value. So there is either use value or exchange value. Now, because we measure value in relation to labor, use value refers to the amount of labor saved through something's being used. So, for instance, a hammer is able to save some labor or to make labor easier. And so its value then will be tied to the amount of labor it is able to save. Now, for something's exchange value, that is how many dollars it'll take to buy a thing. If I make a hat and it's $15, then I'm earning $15 worth of value. Value is not the $15. Value is actually how much labor I am able to get for that hat. So if I sell the hat and get $15, I have $15 worth of possible labor that can be spent, put back into capital, which can then help the process keep going, me to be able to make more hats or whatever. Because when you sell something, what that person is giving you in the form of money is giving you the bounty or what they earned for their labor. So you are taking part of their labor in the form of the money they give you so that you can give them the thing that you've made through labor. Now, he adds to this, that is, he adds to the idea of use value and exchange value, the idea that as something goes up in use value, it will go down in exchange value and vice versa. So for example, air has a lot of use. We all need air. Likewise with water. But the value of those things are pretty low. In fact, they cost nothing. And where by contrast, something that is made purely for superfluous ends like vanity or like reputability, like a diamond necklace, has very little use value, but it has a great deal of exchange value. Now, a commodity's exchange value is going to be determined by not only production, that is, not only labor put into it, but it's also going to be determined by scarcity. So if something is hard to find, if there's high demand for it, but the supply is limited, its monetary value, its nominal price, that is the dollar figure of what it'll cost, is going to go up. Now, having set all of this out, this idea about labor being a determining, or I guess a constitutive part of value, Ricardo then says, wait a second, we must turn our critical gaze upon this idea of labor as though it's just something that is unchanging, that the same amount of labor is going to be used and is going to be worth the same amount, today as it will in 100 years. Ricardo says that ultimately there's no real way to determine labor or to have a perfect standard to determine to determine value. And that is because it's ultimately subjective, and any of these measurements we use to determine value, whether it's labor or if it's, necessities like corn, because corn can be argued to be a good indicator of value because we all need corn. And if we measure things in relation to their value in relation to corn, then we can get a good idea of its value in relation to an absolute necessity. If we determine something's value in relation to gold, we are still going to run into issues because their prices, that is the number value that we use to understand value, even though it's not a perfect measurement, those values are always going to be changing. Labor is always changing. Price of corn is always changing. What it can buy in relation to other things, how much labor it takes to make. All of these things are always changing. And so Ricardo says while we'll never have a perfect standard measure of value, we use labor, we use gold as pretty decent indicators because we just don't have anything else that's so neat, that is so consistent, even though it's not perfectly consistent. So what Adam Smith says in The Wealth of Nations is that with something like corn, that is he takes to be a kind of baseline of all possible value because it's something we all need, something we all consume. He says that if there is a change in the price of corn or the value of corn, then, but let me just asterisk, price and value are not congruent. They are not the same thing. I'm just using it to give us the most easy way to understand an issue with Smith here. So Smith says that if there's a change in the price of corn, then that means something else has happened. Nothing has happened to corn, but maybe money has gotten less valuable, or maybe money has gotten more valuable, which would determine or change how much money is needed to buy corn that is always going to have the same measurement of value. Whereas Ricardo says this is just totally unrealistic. It's almost like Smith is just bracketing off corn from a broader economy, from the exchange in the free market, as though it just transcends everything and floats above everything, when in fact it itself is always going to be subject to various changes. But even so, to reiterate, Ricardo thinks that these are the best measurements we have. So he will talk about value in terms of labor, in terms of corn, in terms of gold, but his real focus here, that is Ricardo's, is on labor. Value being determined by labor. How much labor is required to buy a thing, how much labor you are then saving when you buy a thing, or whatever. But when we talk about value, it's not as though wages paid to laborers is going to be one of the expenses to bring something to the market, to produce an object and then bring it to the market. There's also going to be the cost that goes into machinery, that goes into maintaining buildings, that goes into raw materials. Now, all of these things as well, because they play a part in producing some commodity, will determine and will affect its value. So it's not just human labor per se that gives something value. It's all of these other things. Now, if you're clever, you'd say, well, none of those other things exist on their own. They were only made possible through labor, which is true. So if there's a machine that is introduced into a manufacturer or into a factory or whatever, that might bring more things to market. It might make it easier for things to be produced. And so we will see a decline in labor, but we're going to problematize that as we go forward. But we will say, for example, that labor has gone down because the machine takes over the work of 4 or 5 people, let's say. But it may have taken however many years, however many people to actually build that machine. So it itself is the product of labor. So when we include that price into the price of a commodity, we are still only attaching labor price, the value of labor to that commodity, because the only way that that machine was able to enter the factory was through labor. And this isn't just true under industrialization, industrialized capitalism. He provides the example of hunter-gatherers hunting beavers, for example, where he says that what they might trade that for to another party, another group of people, is not just the amount of time or labor that went into acquiring the beaver. It was also how much labor they had put into making the tools in order to hunt the beaver. Let's say they use a sling or a bow and arrow, whatever. All of that is going to be factored into it as well. So value, I should say, is not only going to be determined by the actual presence of laborers, but all the history of labor that has gone into the production of a thing, which includes, like I said, the labor put into making machines, labor of transportation, labor of, overseers, supervisors, whatever. Now, if you have 2 different commodities, 2 different products that are made with the exact same amount of labor, then technically they should be worth the same amount in the market. That is, their value should be the exact same. Now, there are so many problems with this, not because Ricardo is necessarily wrong, but because we live in a different world now, and it feels very strange to think about value in this way. So, for example, when when one of the Kardashians is paid millions of dollars to make a Twitter post, are they doing labor? And if not, where is that capital, that money, those dollars coming from? What is it being paid for? And so here we enter into a kind of new realm where capital isn't nearly as attached to labor as perhaps it once was. Or if it is much more hidden, which is kind of Marx's nightmare. But we'll get into that with Marx as we go on. Just something, this is just something to keep on the back burner. Now, if everything was equal between two manufacturers that were producing two different commodities, that is the amount of labor and all that put into these two different commodities, then their values should be the same. But the world doesn't work that way, and one manufacturer might have better machinery than another, or another manufacturer might have better workers than another, whatever. Any of these things are going to change the value, or the price even, of a thing when it comes to market, when it is prepared to be sold. But these are two different things. So let's say one enterprise had better machinery and one enterprise had better workers. These draw from two different kinds of capital. So if we remember, capital is everything. It can include, money put into a company in order to pay wages or to pay for machinery or the machinery itself. All of this falls under the domain of capital. But capital can be further differentiated into either fixed capital or circulating capital. So fixed capital is the capital that is able to be procured or put into machines, things that you're going to have for a long time that you might buy once and you have to pay a little bit to maintain, but it's going to be there and it's going to keep earning you the same amount of money, hopefully. Now, circulating capital is capital spent on labor, which is want to change. It might change quite a lot, actually. So you're paying an employee, and if the employee is dissatisfied with how much they're making, they might go work somewhere else. And so that labor is not going to be, or that capital is not going to be fixed. You don't own laborers when you pay them wages, which is kind of this is what Ricardo thinks, so we'll accept that for now. But of course, Marx is going to problematize all of this. Now, between fixed capital and circulating capital, they form a spectrum, I should say. So it's not just as though fixed capital exists totally separate from circulating capital. They, in fact, mirror one another in a lot of ways. So in order to maintain machines, it is required to hire maybe certain laborers that are going to watch over it, which are then apt to change. They might change, they might want to earn more money, they might go work somewhere else. And so does that then change the way that fixed capital is associated with the machine, or circulating capital is associated with the machine? Because now it is determined not only by it as being a stationary thing, but it is now dependent upon circulating capital. So he doesn't really elaborate on this, but it's kind of an important distinction, or it's good to know that fixed capital and circulating capital form a spectrum. Now here's the kicker when it comes to fixed capital and circulating capital. If you had a business that focused more on fixed capital, so let's say a factory, it had lots of machines that it relied on to keep earning it the same kind of money. Now, if we contrast that with a business that relies more on circulating capital, let's say, for example, you have a business of painters, and these painters go around and paint people's houses. That is all circulating capital, because you don't own like a building. You might not even own a building. You might not even own equipment. You might not own anything. It's just you're paying people to do a job, and they might leave, they might go, whatever. Now, if we compare these two kinds of businesses, one reliant on fixed capital versus one reliant on circulating capital, a rise in wages in each of them, or in either of them, is going to have different effects on the price of the thing being produced or the service being provided. So he believes that with a company that relies more on fixed capital, as wages go up, so as the employees are paid more, the value of the product produced will go down. Whereas with circulating capital, or a company or business that relies more on circulating capital, as wages go up, the price of goods, the things being produced, will also go up. So what he's essentially saying here is that less durable machines or less durable equipment, things that are, going to need a lot of circulating capital going through them in order to maintain them, is going to have more of an effect on the cost of the thing being produced than in the case of fixed capital. Or it will have a different effect, I should say. So if there's a business that relies on circulating capital, a lot of money is going to be put to keep, I guess, people happy, to keep, if there are like little pieces of equipment being used, they probably aren't very durable because, there's not a reliance on big, heavy, steady, fixed machines. Then what's going to happen is that as wages go up, and all of those pieces of equipment are going to need to have their little bit of maintenance they're going to need. More of them is going to need to be bought, et cetera, et cetera. As wages go up, because more labor is still going to be needed, then so too will the price of commodities go up, or the price of the things being produced go up. Now, if there's a company or a business that relies more on fixed capital, as wages go up, the owner of the company will say, well, I'm just going to lean more heavily on all my machines because, I don't want to have to pay these people more. And so they will find ways to get around having to pay the people more by probably firing them, laying them off, relying more on the machines, which is going to allow them to actually bring their prices of things down or to keep them the same. Now, all businesses rely on some kind of relationship or proportion between fixed and circulating capital. No one business relies purely on one and another business purely on the other. And so part of the ways that value is ascertained, or it demands an engagement with all of these dynamics between fixed and circulating capital, which is all very abstract and all very difficult to do because it's actually quite difficult to ascertain the difference between circulating and fixed capital because it's a spectrum. And so the best we can kind of do is to just, try, to attach somewhat arbitrary significance to certain things like labor, like gold, corn, in order to have some kind of benchmark, or to be able to say that that machine there represents fixed capital, whereas, the paper person, the paper boy throwing papers around is an example of circulating capital, not mentioning, of course, the fact that the bike is fixed capital for the kid who's relying upon it potentially forever to do their job. But anyways. But with all this being said, a raise in wages does not necessarily mean that the value of labor has gone up. It might have meant as well that the value of money has gone down. So it takes more money to be able to pay for people to do their job. So if before $10 was what you paid someone an hour, if that raised to $11 because of inflation, the people are still going to be, the workers I should say, are still going to be earning the same amount in real value, because $11 is going to buy you out in the real world everything that $10 used to. You're going to have a higher wage, but you're still going to have the same buying power. Or the real value will have stayed the same, whereas the nominal value will have changed, or the nominal price will have changed, which is just the number price. So to determine something's real value will be to say, okay, how much of other things in the world can I buy with this thing? Now that is what it's called, its natural price. So let's say a hat will get you 2 pieces of cloth. Let's just say, for example, it gets you 2 pieces of cloth. And then the next year, it can suddenly get you 3 pieces of cloth. Now, if we just look at that one example, we could say either that the value of the hat has gone up, allowing you to buy more with it, with the money you get for it, it'll allow you to buy more cloth, or the value of cloth has gone down, in which case it takes less to buy more of it. But if we found out as well, if we took many more examples, let's say 1 year a hat, you get 2 pieces of cloth, you can get 2 cartons of milk, you can get half a dozen eggs with it, all of that, each one of those things potentially for the hat. And the next year you're able to get more of all of those things. You can probably be pretty certain that the value of the hat, its real value, has gone up. So it has become more expensive. It has gone above the natural price. That is what it was the year before in relationship to all of these things. And it has attained a kind of new value in that world. Now, of course, with time, those things will come to balance out again and they'll attain what is kind of called the natural price of things. that is however many things the hat can buy in relation to others. But for a moment, it will have risen in real value, not just in the dollar value, because now it buys a lot more of everything else. So value is determined largely by relationships. So the relationship between labor gone into producing something. But also it can be ascertained by relationships between various people, between the three classes, broad classes of society, between landowners, capitalists, and workers, where if one of those groups' buying power from one year to the next suddenly goes up, then we are seeing a disequilibrium. We are seeing a departure from the natural rate or the natural price and the natural order of things, and one of those classes has attained more power than before, or more real value than before. And that, that's essentially lays out the first chapter. It's the longest of the bunch, so don't worry, the next ones are gonna be much quicker. And that sets out pretty much his view on value, which is an important one and one to really have a strong grasp of going forwards. Now that brings us here into chapter 2 on rent. Now this is probably the most important part of this whole book, because here is where he establishes or lays out his view of rent that is diametrically opposed to many other political economists of the time, specifically Adam Smith, Buchanan, and Malthus, who all have an erroneous or incorrect view of how rent, the value of rent, or even the price of rent, is determined. So in the work of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, he pretty much says that rent is the product of profits. So if I owned a piece of land and some capitalist were to come along and say, hey, this is a great piece of land, let me put up this building here, I can start manufacturing, and I will pay you a proportion of the profits being made. Or if I have a plot of land, some farmer might come along, this capitalist might come along, whatever, and say, hey, this is a great plot of land for me to earn some dollars off of by growing some corn. Let me grow some corn here and I'll give you some money for profit, or in proportion to the profit that I make. So that's how the landlord will make money through rent for Adam Smith. Now Ricardo sets out a completely different vision of rent here, and it is the crux of this whole book. For me, I don't know how it wouldn't be the crux of the whole book, because it comes up over and over again. So it's very important to know, but it's also a little bit tricky to illustrate, at least through words. So I'm going to try be as clear as humanly possible in order to make this accessible so that you know what's going on. Now let's imagine a new territory is discovered with no one living on it, and it is just filled with fertile land. The people who find it, and there's no one else there, the people who find it obviously are going to start working on the land, and they're going to start growing things on the part of the land that is the easiest to grow on, which just makes sense. They're not going to go to the barren parts of the land to try to grow produce. That's just a bad idea. So they're going to go to the most fertile part of the land that is the easiest to work on. But because they're the first ones there, they aren't paying any rent. So let's say, they have a colony, or there's a country that they are part of that they've just kind of departed from for a bit. They might say, okay, well, we are making so much corn on this plot of land to feed ourselves, yet we have all of this surplus corn. We have corn that just goes way above what we need. Why don't we just sell it back to the country that we came from? Sell it back to the nearest city, whatever. So they are only going to be making like pure profit off of that. After they pay the workers that they've got there or whatever, they're going to just pay them, and they aren't paying rent to anybody. So they're just having a great old time making as much corn as possible. And, what that does is it makes the population happier. Now let's say that suddenly the corn that was being made on that piece of land was no longer enough. So the populations just started to grow. For any number of reasons, the population started to grow. There might be more demand coming from the city. And so the people on this plot of land are like, okay, well, we have to expand. But expanding demands that they expand into the less fertile land. they're going to need to expand into those parts of the country that make it harder to grow on, probably. So let's call this next plot of land plot 2. So we have plot 1 that was super easy to grow on. Now we have plot 2, and it's a little bit more difficult. So by putting in the same amount of labor, you make less because it demands more work to actually get produce from it, to get more corn from it, or to get the same amount as the first plot of land. So you have two options. Either you employ the same amount of labor and make less produce, you make less corn, or you employ more labor and you make the same amount of corn. In either case, it's going to be somewhat detrimental. So it's going to either cost more to employ more labor to earn the same amount, to make the same amount of corn, or you're going to make less money off of it because you're going to have made less corn by employing the same amount of labor. But between these two plots of land, that is between the fertile one, plot 1, and the less fertile one, plot 2, you can't charge different prices for the corn. Otherwise, the plot on the second land won't be able to sell any of their corn, and there would have been no reason for it. So they have to sell the corn at the same price. Otherwise, there was no point of doing it in the first place. So the value of the corn then, the price of the corn then, is going to be determined by however expensive it is to make, to grow on the less fertile plot of land. So you're going to use that as your benchmark. So let's say on the first plot of land, it cost $100. This is absolutely a ridiculous number, but let's say, for example, it cost you $100 to make all of the corn. And you were able to sell that for $110, for example. So you make $10 profit on the first plot of land. Now the second plot of land, you have to put in $110 in order to make, $115. So you only make a profit of $5 on the second plot of land. So the first plot of land makes a profit of $10, whereas the second plot of land makes a profit of $5. Now, it wouldn't make much sense if one of those people was earning more than the other. That is, with one person earning $10, another person earning $5, because then the person earning $5 will say, screw this, I'm out of here. So they must actually create some kind of equilibrium between the two in order to balance it out. And this equilibrium comes in the form of rent, where now the person who owns the most fertile plot of land is going to, transform into this thing called the landlord, who is then going to take $5 off of the $10 profit in order to pay for themselves, to pay, to earn money for owning this fertile plot of land. So rent is going to come out of the profits of the most fertile land. Whereas the other plot of land number 2, pays no rent for Ricardo. So the price of a thing is going to be determined by however difficult it is to make the less fertile plot of land, because it has to be equal all across the board. So we have to take the lowest possible measure as being the determining one. Not lowest as in money value, but lowest as in least quality one that is sold for the highest amount, or that is the most difficult to make, that is therefore sold for the highest amount. Otherwise, no one would work that land, because if the first plot of land just made their prices higher than the other, or lower than the other, then they would just run them out of business and there will have been no point. But the problem will remain: how do you make up for the demand? How do you satisfy that demand? So the value of an object, the price of an object, is going to be determined by the least fertile plot of land if we're talking about raw produce here, if we're talking about things being grown. Whereas rent is only going to come out of those ones that came before it, that are more fertile than the other one. And the rent is going to be the difference between the profits the first one makes versus the profit the second one makes. Now let's say hypothetically that second plot of land has been worked to as much as it can be, and a third plot of land then needs to be explored, needs to be used up. That plot of land will then determine the price of the objects. That plot of land, the plot of land number 3, will pay no rent, and now plot of land number 2 will start to pay rent because it is earning more profit than the other one, plot of land number 3, and the difference between them will determine how much rent is being paid, while still the difference between the first and the second, but as well now between the first and the third, is going to determine how much rent the first plot of land makes. Now, this might all be very difficult to imagine in your head. So if you just imagine 3 plots of land, just to, I guess, get the most basic understanding here, the most fertile one will pay the most rent, whereas the least fertile one is going to be the one that determines the price of the objects, and it is the one that pays no rent. And rent is determined by the difference between the most recently employed land versus the last and any one before it, the employed land before it. Now, in Adam Smith's work, he said that rent will determine the price of objects. If we take the price of things being produced. If we take Ricardo seriously here, then he's effectively shown that that is not the case. Rent does not determine the value of objects. In fact, it is the labor, the difficulty and toil of the least fertile land that is going to determine the value of grown products in this case. So high rent doesn't come from earning more, per se. High rent is the product of a less abundant land being employed, being sought after, being cultivated, not the sign of the most abundant land being cultivated. So rent is not determined by high price of commodities or the other way around. Rent does not determine that. It is only determined, rent is determined by labor put onto the least fertile, least workable land. So if new machines were used on the land, or if new methods of agriculture were discovered, what that would mean might be that we no longer need to work on the less cultivatable lands or the less fertile lands, or we're able to make more from it. Now, what that will do is it will shrink the gap between the first plot of land and the last plot of land being cultivated, and what that will mean is actually a reduction in rent. So as a country grows more efficient, as it grows more productive, as it develops new technology, rent will actually go down for Ricardo, not up. Because for Smith, he says as society progresses, rent will go up because people are earning more and they'll be able to pay more. Ricardo thinks that that's totally wrong for the reasons I've already just said. So whereas the capitalist and the laborer are kind of on the same side here, they want their lives to be easier when it comes to working the land, the landlord doesn't want that. The landlord wants it to be difficult because that means then that worse land is being cultivated, which means that it is very difficult, which means that the price paid to them in rent will go up because there will be a bigger gap between the most fertile land and the least fertile land. Now, that's an important thing to know as we go forward here throughout the rest of the book, because it's going to come up again and again and again. Now, here we move on to chapter 3 on the rent of mines, where he says that essentially like land, the rent of mines will be determined by the difficulty in, I guess, attaining things from the mine. And so the most difficult mine to actually mine in will be the one that is going to determine the value of the objects circulating within the economy, and not because of the easiest mine to work in. So the value of anything taken from the mines, like gold or silver or whatever, its value is going to be determined by the total quantity of labor necessary to obtain it and to bring it to market. So it's not as though it's just going to determine value or increase value because these things like gold and silver are innately valuable. They're only going to go up in value as they have a relationship to the labor put into them. And that puts us here into chapter 4, the difference between a natural price of something and the market price. So the natural price refers to the price that anything has in relation to everything else in the market. And so this natural price is a price at equilibrium between supply and demand, between other things in the market, and so on. Of course, there might be like trends, for example, that make it so that linen is more fashionable than whatever, cashmere is more fashionable than linen, whatever. You might have trends like that, and you might see then the money price of something go up, but it will eventually gravitate back down to its equilibrium, to its natural price. And whereas its market price will just be what it goes for nominally, how many dollars it will be, it'll cost to get it. But, just to meditate on this for a second, it's exceptionally interesting to me that this idea about value is so determined through money. Because money is no real standard of value, or that value is determined by a thing's relationship to other things, like how many of those other things can you get for this thing. So value is always being deferred, like it's never found in anything itself, but it only comes from relationships to other things in a certain economy of commodities. Now, what this does is essentially reveal just how subjective it is, and it's all that much more mysterious to me how then we are able to have any agreement at all. Yet we can. But anyways, that's just something that interests me. Now that puts us into chapter 5 on wages. And this book is like 30-some chapters long, and the first two, that is the one on value and the one on rent, are the longest. But everything else is like a few of them are only like a page long, and it's kind of silly. So it might come off like I'm just saying like a list, like and then this, and then this, and then this. And sorry, that's not the best storytelling, but working with what I got here. So yeah, chapter 5 on wages. So the value of wages for Ricardo is going to be affected by the supply and demand of laborers and the price of commodities. So like any other product in the marketplace, wages or labor has both a natural and a market price. So the natural price of labor is the price required in order to keep the laborers alive and happy. Because if you don't do that, then you won't have laborers. So if $10 is the agreed price, let's say per hour for a laborer, it is implied that $10 is what is going to be required for them to have shelter, to have food, to have whatever else they might need in order to survive. Now the next year, that might have to go up to $11 because the price of everything else has gone up for whatever reason, inflation, whatever. So what that means then is its market price has gone up, its nominal price, it has gone from $10 to $11, but its real price has stayed the same because it is still implied that they are still going to be making the same amount to buy the same things that they could before, the same necessities, the same food, shelter that they could before. So if the cost of necessities goes up, if the cost of goods go up, so too must the cost of wages, because you still need your laborers to be able to make or buy those things, I should say, that they need to survive. But it works both ways. So if the price of necessities or goods goes down, then so too will the price of labor. Now that's all well and good in some kind of fairy tale world where people will just accept to have a decrease in wages, but that's really not how it happens in the real world, as it shouldn't. But in any case, this is what he gives us, that as the price of commodities go up, then wages will have to go up as well. And the reverse is also true. Now, the natural price of labor will always attain some degree of equilibrium. But the problem here is that sometimes the effects are difficult to ascertain, where capitalists might say, okay, I think we can bring down the price of labor. I think we can pay them less because the price of X, Y, and Z things has gone down, so they should be fine. But then they do that, and suddenly thousands of people starve to death, and they're like, oh, we have to bring it back up. So what is the price of life at that point? It seems totally wrong to just leave it totally up to the free market because there are these potential negative effects. There seems that there should be oversight to make sure that no single life is lost because of someone's greed. But Ricardo doesn't consider that. Instead, he says that almost any tax or any kind of law that limits this or that sets like minimum wage standards is going to be harmful to the poorer classes. And he also proposes regulating reproduction of poor people, which is, just eugenics that is very clearly very clearly problematic and not anything that should be espoused. And it's quite ironic because he's against one form of regulation but for another. He's okay with regulating bodies but not regulating the market. And it's funny, we see very much that the same impulses that govern many conservative trends in North America. It's all about policing people's bodies, but let the market that affects people on an immeasurable scale, let it do whatever it wants. And that'll stop the first episode here at the end of the chapter 5 on wages. And from here, we'll move on from chapter 6 on profits. And if you listen this far, thanks a lot. If there's anything I got wrong here, I'd love to hear about it. If there's anything you liked, leave a comment. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, and I think even Spotify now, if you can leave comments wherever you've listened to this in podcast form, do it. I'd love to hear from you. Leave 5 stars if you can, if you like what I did. And catch you next time. Take care.